Okay, great stuff. Thank you, Jen, and thank you to colleagues joining us for this this media briefing around our purchase of the former St Mary's School site in Shaftesbury and the consultation that we're launching today. For those of you who've not used Teams before, I noticed most of you have turned your cameras off. That's helpful with bandwidth. If you want to do that while we're presenting, and also mute your microphones, stops any unwanted interruptions as we go through the session. I'm going to introduce the session, and we'll be sharing a screen in a second with the presentation, but I'll introduce some of my colleagues who are here with us here today. So I have with me Councillor Spencer Flower, who is the leader of Dorset Council, and he's chair of the cross-party member steering group. I've also got Councillor Andrew Parry, who is just turning his camera on, is the portfolio holder for Children's Services. I've got myself, I'm Chief Executive of Dorset Council, Matt Prosser, and I'm also chair of the project board. Teresa Levy, who is our Executive Director for People, Children and the project sponsor. And then finally, Vic Verma, who is our project director for the project, and obviously our wonderful communications team sitting in the background. So I'm going to hand over in just a second to Teresa Levy, who's going to set out what we've bought. And then Vic Verma will take us through the issues that have led us to our preferred option for the site that we will set out today in our consultation process. Kate, if you'd like to start sharing the slides, that'd be fantastic. So the purchase has come from the council's capital budget, and if subject to the consultation our preferred option is taken forwards, it could become part of a much larger capital programme and strategy for the development of schools in Dorset and the provision of support for our children with special educational needs and disabilities, otherwise known as SEND, as you'll see in the presentation. I'm sure many of you are aware of that term. The key for us is that would be with the existing facilities that are on site, it could accelerate that strategy for provision. Before I do that, however, can I set out why we need to consult before taking a decision about the use of the site? So local authorities have lots and lots of legal obligations, and this is one of them. And one of the legal obligations under Best Value, part of the Local Government Act 1999, is to consult service users, residents and interest groups in Dorset before making a decision about how to change the way we may deliver a service. This means that Dorset can have a preferred option, but we must also keep our minds ajar, legal term, and allow space to have regard to consultees' views. So this means that we've set out a range of potential other alternative uses for the St Mary's site for consultees to express views on, and also left some space for them to suggest some other things that we may not have thought about. The council has a duty to pay due regard to that consultation feedback, but it does not involve an obligation to follow consultee suggestions. And Dorset Council must also take into account other relevant considerations such as value for money, what the service needs are, council policies that are already in place, and equality considerations. I hope that was helpful, and certainly if you play that back on the recording, you catch some of that. So Teresa, can I invite you to talk to us about what Dorset Council has actually bought on the site first of all? Teresa.
Thank you, Matt, and good afternoon, colleagues. So I'm Teresa Levy, Executive Director for Children, and leading this project as a result of our preferred option, which is to really invest heavily in improving the outcomes for our children with special educational needs and disabilities across the county, and St Mary's Shaftesbury being part of that. So the aerial photograph shows the capacity and the mass of buildings and land that is St Mary's Shaftesbury, but it can at times take us into a space of imagining that all of the buildings on site are very old buildings. And in fact, very, very many of them aren't. But the aerial photograph does capture the entirety of, well, we have purchased the entirety of that site known as St Mary's Shaftesbury, including the main school buildings, etc. Lots of different art blocks and studios, lots of different gymnasiums, sports halls, indoor swimming pools, a chapel, playing fields, sport pitches, walled gardens and paddocks. Absolutely, there are a number of older buildings, however they are all in a good state of repair. There will be some requirement for us to modernise to suit our own requirements once we have that clarified as part of the public consultation, but generally they are all in good repair. The main school building, the assembly hall, the large canteen refectory, certainly the canteen, and some of the other classrooms, the small study rooms, the laboratories and the art blocks are much more modern day than the original building, which is more Gothic in its status. So these are some live photographs there of the assembly hall, the canteen. This is one of the classrooms as it is today. So one of the things that's true of the site is that the children left in March. Clearly the anticipation at that time was that they would be returning in some fashion or otherwise, and so actually it is really left as it was, with chairs, desks, books, pens, all in place, but certainly very modern, very well equipped and very ready to go for the purpose that is our preferred option. As I've said, some of the blocks, whilst they look older from the aerial view, have actually, as you can see from this photograph, been adapted and modernised over time and are now very fit for purpose, modern, disability access, usable spaces. And there are also across the building, within some of the older aspects, conference facilities on site. An indoor swimming pool that is presently kept full and warm, which would clearly be part of our consideration around usage for the future. Extensive living accommodation in the place of former boarding houses, which again you can see from this photograph are modern buildings that are largely well provided for with bathroom, toilet and boarding facilities. You can also notice there on that building the solar panels, of which there are a number of places where they have deployed solar panels in the past, and that may well be something that we as a council would want to continue into the future. There is, as you may well be aware, a chapel on site. It looks like a very old chapel. It's actually not. It's only built in the 1960s, but built in the form of others. And happy to have any conversation with colleagues about that afterwards. That's the chapel. That's the view from the first floor, which also houses the organ. And there is actually a flat in the lower ground floor of the chapel. So again, within this photograph, you can see some of those boarding houses, but you can also see to the left some other distinct properties. These are 3 4-bedroomed houses with all en suites, which were previously used as staffing accommodation, and we will be considering their usage. And the house there in the foreground, which is a 4-bedroomed, separate, distinct property again. And there are the playing pitches and the tennis courts. So further playing pitches and further playing fields and further open area and open spaces in terms of green fields. So the building is referred to by us in all of our consultation as St Mary's Shaftesbury. That's what it's known as. That's how people recognise it. It is in fact on the Dorset-Wiltshire border. It is closest to Shaftesbury, but clearly Wiltshire are the planning authority. I'm going to hand over to Vic Verma, who's the project director for this programme. And Vic, if you could talk to us about some of the children and the broader strategy that we're looking to have St Mary's Shaftesbury as part of.
Thank you, Teresa. So as a local authority, we have a statutory duty to deliver educational provision for children and young people with special educational needs. And we need more specialist provision for children who have SEND. In 2021, so as of our most recent data, we have around 3,000 children and young people with an education, health and care plan. If we go back to 2015, it was less than 1,500 when the reforms came about. If we could go to the next slide, please. Now, Dorset's fortunate to have excellent special schools, but many are oversubscribed. Increasing numbers of our children with SEND are often having to attend expensive independent provision where our special schools are full, many far out of county. And ultimately, we believe it would be better for our children with SEND well-being if they could be educated in high quality provision more locally. And this is part of our Children, Young People and Families plan to deliver the best education for all. And as you'll see in the data there, approximately 250 children and young people attend independent provision across either Dorset or out of county. Now, the financial implications are that quite often independent provision can range in cost, but on average, it's approximately £60,000 a year. Now, that same provision delivered locally by our excellent special schools costs around £22,000 per year. So there's a significant financial pressure there where we could be delivering this provision more economically efficiently ourselves. And costs have grown over the last few years from around £6.7 million to more recently a £14 million pressure, which is where some of that demand for new educational provision within Dorset is coming from. So that leads us to our preferred option through the consultation, which is that we would like to create a special educational needs school so that we can offer that fantastic high quality provision closer to home for our children and young people with SEND. As set out in our children's plan, we're very ambitious for our SEND families and believe this is an amazing facility, as you'll have seen in some of the photos earlier, and could help us meet that growing need and reduce costs in the future. Now, the alternative uses, the other uses for the site as set out here, and as set out in our consultation, give some ideas of some of the other options that were considered. And of course, there may be other ideas that members of the public want to come forward with through the consultation. But there's a couple of bullet points there. And I'll hand back to Matt.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Teresa, and to you, Vic. So the council, as we've just said, is open to other uses of the site. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the briefing, we've considered some other options, but there may be other things that come up through the consultation process that it reveals. So we want to work with those for whom we have a duty, those in Dorset Council area, before we take a final decision via our cabinet in late April. So perhaps I can open up to questions on the presentation you've heard today. If you haven't used Teams before, it's easy if you post in the chat bar RTS, which is request to speak, and then I can manage the order of people coming in with questions, and I can direct it to the most appropriate person to answer that question who's on the call. If we can't answer any questions in the session this afternoon, we will of course take them away and answer them as soon as possible via our communications team. So I've got Sam coming in first. Sam, can I invite you to speak?
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Sam. Yep.
I think just to start off with, the council's capital budget, that comes from Dorset Council.
Yes, so our capital budget comes from a number of sources. It comes from money that we've built up over the year either through the sale of assets. Our capital strategy could also be funded through grants from government, or as I say, assets that we've sold in the past and we've got money in the bank for.
Okay, and why was the building bought at a time like this then? I think we put a pre-story up before this consultation started, and a lot of people have questioned the timing more than anything. I think during a pandemic.
So I think the answer to that simple answer to that, I'll pick that one up, Sam, is that it's part of a bigger strategy. We have an ongoing capital strategy for developing and building schools, obviously to meet the needs of the population as it grows over time, and therefore we've got to think to the future. It's not just about the here and now. And the thing that was attractive to us about the potential for this site, if the consultation outcome says yes, this is the thing that we should do, is that it helps us to accelerate that strategy and reduce that cost. So as Vic said, at the moment, for those children who have to go out of county provision, the average cost is around £60,000 per pupil. Whereas if we provide that provision locally ourselves, it can be down in the 20,000. So you can see already quite a big gap for each individual pupil. This school site has massive potential for, I think, pupil numbers of up to 280 pupils potentially, or possibly even further than that, depending on how intensively the site's used. And that gives us the ability to reduce our costs in the future. And that's an important part of our budgeting process.
Yeah, I think with the budgeting then, was that weighed up against possibly, is it a case of buying now instead of spending money over a period of time, converting buildings?
Yes, you could call it a spend to save in that respect, if that's what the site's used for in the future. I mean, there have been comments, I understand, around the value of the site and the value of the school. I should tell you that the value of building a new school from scratch, or the facilities we've got on a site like St Mary's, would be 4, 5, 6 times the amount that's been paid for the site. I know some people can't perhaps get their heads around that, but schools are incredibly expensive to build in terms of making sure they've got the right provision. And what we've got here is purpose built.
Okay. Why Shaftesbury as well? You know, what are the benefits of the area? Would you not prefer somewhere a bit more central in Dorset?
Well, of course, everybody would love to have the strategy and say, right, that's where we'll put it, at the centre of the heart of where we need this. This was an opportunistic purchase. The site came up where it was. We didn't get to choose that piece, but obviously because it is such good value in respect of that, and it is, as I say, built almost purpose built for the needs that we could see here, it reduces the amount of time it would take us to bring forward. To go from a decision now through a planning process, through the budgeting process, through the building process to create a school could take several years, and therefore this helps us to accelerate that strategy. Sam, can I bring George in as the next questioner?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Thanks, George.
Thanks, Matt. I've got two questions, if that's okay. So my first one is, obviously, older schools tend to have been, well, they have been built a while ago, and may not be up to the disability, accessibility standards of today. Will Dorset Council be making changes for accessibility for those people who are physically disabled?
So George, on the outcome of the consultation, if this is the preferred option is taken forwards, first of all, just explain some of the blocks on that site as Teresa set out, and perhaps some of the pictures don't quite convey it. Some of them were built as recently as in the last 5-6 years, so are already DDA compliant, disability compliant in that respect. There may be some other adaptations that we need to take into account, but I don't know whether Teresa or Vic want to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Matt. Yes, so thank you, George. Great question. In fact, a vast majority of the classroom spaces already have ramp access and wheelchair accessible doors. They also are, many of them, on the ground floor. Some of the older parts of the building are not so accessible, but actually the previous school had gone quite a long way to be an accessible option. So we'll certainly have the benefit of that. But if we were to proceed with running a school there, we would obviously do DDA assessments as part of that.
Well, and my second question was just to ask, what about, because I know that there was there's still some question about looked after children for the county. You know, we've got a lot of children who are looked after outside of the county. Is this going to be used to help bring more children in?
Teresa, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, thank you. So again, absolutely, you're completely right. In addition to not having enough SEND school places in the county and therefore exporting too many of our children into expensive external school places, we sadly are doing the same with our children in care and having too many of those children in care outside of the county too. Alongside this, the council has also invested in a range of other sufficiency options for us. The Dorchester Road piece, which you'll have seen in terms of capacity in Weymouth for children in care, and other options around the county. That doesn't mean that we are excluding that as an option for St Mary's Shaftesbury, and that may be something that absolutely members of the public and others involved in children's lives around the county give us feedback on. There are some potential options that would be suitable for that on site, and we would obviously have that at the forefront of our mind in terms of the right thing for our children and limiting pressurised budgets too, George. Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, George. Can I bring in Kerry Jones, please?
Hello, I've got 3 questions, if I may be so greedy. They're all very Shaftesbury feedback focused. You've got a clear vision of your preferred intended use, likely to involve young people. How likely do you think at this stage is it that members of the community will be able to access tennis and pool facilities on the site in the future?
So I think it's really important that the local community has their voice and shares that, and we're certainly aware, having purchased a site, about how the community has previously been using that and the access that they've had to certain parts of those facilities. So as part of that consultation, we want to hear from those groups how they've used it, how they think they might use it in the future. Clearly, we've got to be mindful about what our future uses of the site, and can those uses be complementary to each other. But if you know the site and the size of it, you'll know that some parts are quite clearly easily to be accessible without actually compromising the use of the main school buildings. But Teresa, do you have any further thoughts?
Yes, thank you. So I mean, we're really wanting to build a provision here that is largely embedded and engaged with the community. What we absolutely don't want to do is to have a place where any of our most valuable children are excluded or outside of that local community that they're operating within. But as you'll appreciate, Kerry, that's complicated, and it needs to be thought through very carefully around access to site where safeguarding of children with additional needs is also important, and thinking that through. And then frankly making sure that everything we do, whatever the options of the consultation outcome with, is the best value for all of the residents of Dorset. So there will be a value consideration in that, as well as a security of site implication.
My second question, thank you, relates to access that you touched upon there. Shaftesbury Town Council has said in the council meeting that he'd like better access between St Mary's and the town. Have you considered that in your plans? Because it is difficult getting down the A30 if you're not using a car.
I think it's fair to say that's not something we've looked at directly. Obviously, we're talking about a matter of metres between the Dorset boundary and the Wiltshire boundary. But I understand the point you're making. As you drive from the outskirts of the town, it's rural. The site access is owned, and parts just either side of the driveway are owned, but the other fields are in private ownership. So we'd have to think about that in terms of how we could do that. But that's something we could very much take on board during the consultation.
And a final question, if I may. I appreciate there's no reference to this at all in your plans, but your accompanying documentation does talk about your capital fund being resourced through asset sales, and locals, as I'm sure you know, are very sensitive about housing development in this area. There's been lots of chatter on social media, suggestions or beliefs that some of the land may be sold off for estates or developments. Can you say anything to address those concerns, please?
Well, we've purchased the site and we've put forward our preferred option at this stage, and we're looking to hear what the community of Dorset, the whole community of Dorset, says we should use the site for. So we're not ruling anything in or out in that respect. But obviously, if a part of the site was to be taken for a different purpose than our preferred option, we would have to go through a proper consultation process around that, and also be talking with our near neighbour Wiltshire, who are obviously the planning authority. Now, the designations on site might be already there in terms of planning designations. I'm not entirely certain, but I am aware of that quiz and question around the issues around housing. We will take that on board during the consultation. Thanks, Kerry.
Thank you.
Was that your third question?
That was it, yes. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Right, I've got Steve Keenan next, and then Helen Fitch. So Steve first.
Yeah, hi, Matt. Couple of short questions as well. Just trying to get a sense of, if your preferred option goes through for the school for 280 pupils, will that take up 90% of the existing site or 50%? What's going to be left over for other options?
So that's a really good question, Steve. And obviously, it's a 55-acre site. Not all of that is covered by buildings. In fact, much of it is very green and covered in trees and other facilities. But Teresa, do you want to got some thoughts on?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, that's absolutely a key question, and I think that what we can see is that there would be other options, which we're also kind of really interested to hear from members of the public on, in terms of the consultation around. There would still be space, I think, within the 240 for there to be other activities, maybe some issues around that are complementary to that primary requirements. So maybe adult learning, maybe supported employment opportunities, maybe some local holiday activity in terms of how that might work. I think we could imagine that it might be possible to think about that site and the extensions on that site as having some other complementary activities that we're looking for. But I think it's important, as we've absolutely outlined, is that this is our preferred option. If that were to happen, that would be primacy in terms of making sure that everything that happened around that was, as I've said, really complementing that school offer, that offer for young people living in an environment where they can see potential for themselves for the future. So if it's something in line with that, I think that would be highly likely in the future, Steve.
Okay, just to follow up on that, you've obviously looked at all the accommodation and the buildings available. The school would take care of the pool, the accommodation on site, the boarding, and so on and so on. There's only going to be bits and pieces left, isn't there, around the edge, more or less?
There are a number of distinct buildings, as I've said. There are a number of distinct houses, and there are a number of the boarding houses are slightly separate. Some of the blocks of learning are separate to the main learning blocks that we might require at the moment for those children on roll. As we go forward, it will become much more obvious to us around how we distinguish between that, and then the fields and the opportunities for that open space.
Okay.
We are clear that there was enough capacity for our primary intention, and that would be our focus for right now for this consultation, and potentially for year 1 and 2 for sure.
Okay, thank you. And just a secondary question, back of the fag packet calculation sort of thing. If you've got 280 pupils there and you're going to be saving £38,000 per pupil by bringing them in-house rather than sending away, that's 9.5 million. So you think you could cover the cost of the purchase within a year or two?
Well, I think like any business plan, you don't start at 280, do you? You will build that up, and Teresa perhaps will talk about how we would potentially build up the role if that's the option that gets taken forward. But yes, absolutely. The issue is to reduce the revenue cost by making this capital expenditure over a good period of time. But the main issue is about the right provision for our children in Dorset.
Okay.
Teresa.
Thanks, Matt. I love fag packet mathematics, but I'm not going to fall into that one just right now, Steve, if I'm honest, because as Matt says, it is about slowly building the role is really important, because we want to get the right children. We're really blessed with having outstanding special schools across the whole county, but they're bursting at the seams, and so we want to be able to resource those children's needs in a much more local way, alongside the other already existing outstanding provision that we have, and also increasing that outstanding provision where we can to meet the final elements of the need that we have, because even St Mary's Shaftesbury wouldn't fulfil all of our requirement at this time. As we go through that, we will change our pattern of spend. That's a different message to saving general fund money. It's a complicated issue about how schools are funded, but fundamentally we have to change our pattern of spend, and we want to be having our children in Dorset in outstanding provision, and as we do that we will change the way and the amount of money we're spending on them. Absolutely.
Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Helen from Swanage News.
Hello, I have 3 questions. The first one is, how does this purchase tally with Dorset Council's policy on climate change? I mean, what are its eco credentials as such?
Okay, so in terms of bit of feedback going on there. Hang on. In terms of the purchase of the site, so the site already comes with significant amounts of solar, and it's also got a biomass boiler on site. For us, buying a facility that we can repurpose rather than building a new facility does give them an amount of offset. So I think it fits quite nicely with that. Currently, we obviously have children who are having to be transported far outside of county areas where we're having to buy that specialist provision. And if we're able to, for those children to be part of this campus site, then obviously they wouldn't be travelling as far. So that also helps to contribute to that issue. It's not just about children, it's about families that support around them. And families travel to see their children, and that's also driving extra distances. But Teresa might have some other thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. I mean, it's a big site. It's a big site. It's going to take some real kind of creative thinking about how we make it as green as possible. There are options around some of that. There's some, firstly, there's some significant capacity to replant some large trees that were planted with some more appropriate plantings. Looking forward to thinking about that and making sure that that's supporting our carbon footprint. As Matt says, there's already a significant amount of solar which we can increase and look at enhancing with some of that, and really making sure that we're maximising the use of those modernised buildings, and absolutely limiting the costs of the older buildings is a clear part of our plan to make sure that the overheads are managed.
Well, one of my next question would be, obviously we're based down in Swanage, so in terms of Swanage people, obviously this is so far North Dorset that, as you've actually pointed out, it's actually Wiltshire. So I mean, it's really positive to be able to say, to educate children locally, but what would you say to people in Swanage that actually this feels it is actually going out of county? So what is the provision there for people right on the south coast?
Yeah, thank you. So we are blessed with a fabulously diverse county, aren't we? And wanting to make sure we have got enough offer for all of our children with additional needs across the county remains a challenge. We are looking at extensions in the east of the county and in the Weymouth and and Portland area and potentially in the west, and always looking at trying to limit how far our children travel. And I completely appreciate that from the Swanage space, you know, the travelling is only going in one direction, isn't it, usually, and that's extensive. So we absolutely look at that. We map very carefully where our children live and what their requirements are, and are looking to really get as much coverage as we can. Not all of the same approach as St Mary's Shaftesbury, they won't be. But as I've said before, we are really blessed with having outstanding provision already and wanting to build on that. And also, as part of the strategy, really, Helen, making sure that we have in-reach into schools in different parts where we're not going to have specialist provision necessarily in every square mile, for sure, that we can have in-reach into other schools to support children staying in school. That's our first position. Wherever we can, we want children staying in mainstream schools. And so our strategy is also about having in-reach into those schools, having communication support in those schools, because we know that's a big issue for us, having support to children with autism, and having support to children with social, emotional and mental health challenges, because those are our 3 areas of real consideration. So it won't be buildings for everybody, it won't be St Mary's Shaftesbury for everybody, absolutely, but we are looking to make sure that we have good coverage across the whole county.
So are you saying that actually this provision will free up spaces in schools that are closer to Swanage, say? So would this mean that there's a greater chance of getting space in, say, Dorchester or around, you know, is that what you're saying?
It will certainly take some of the pressure out of the border system. As I've said, what our real target is to keep children in mainstream with support. So we know that's what children want, we know that's what families want. Where that's appropriate and achievable, we're going to do everything we can to do that. Where children do require special education, we want that to be as local as possible, appreciating that this is just absolutely, I'm going to argue that it's just out of county, but it's only just out of county, so that's better than where we are at the moment, and it's cheaper than where we'd be going. So we are really looking at, yes, taking pressure and heat out of the border system so that the border system can support more children.
Okay, and my final question is, it does seem, and you know, I think this is what people in Dorset will be thinking, really, is the fact that, you know, you had a budget for a special school and a grant, and now you've purchased this site and now you've got a consultation. It does feel a bit like a tick box process. Now, it may be something you've got to go through, but how do we, you know, what would you say to people who say, look, there's no point me filling out this consultation, this is a tick box exercise?
Yeah.
Thanks, Helen. If I pick that one up from my introduction, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. This is a consultation that we statutorily have to run as local government under our best value regs, but we really do want to hear from all of our communities, particularly families who have been affected and have got children with special educational needs and disabilities, to understand what their views are. And like you've just quite clearly articulated, how do families in Swanage who are looking at this think about that school in Shaftesbury, potentially, because actually it's a long way for them. But as Teresa's articulated, if it releases pressure in the wider system, that might open up opportunity for them that didn't previously exist. So we really would encourage your readers to give us their feedback, to give us their honest feedback about how we should use that site, so we can take it all on board. I know the question from Steve was, you know, what's going to be left over from the site. It is a big site. There are plenty of opportunities for us to think about on that site, complementary to that preferred option if we go ahead with it. So please encourage them still to fit it in. It isn't just a tick box. We do want to hear from those community groups. We are meeting with families. We've got a various number of briefings coming up over the next week. So we'll be meeting with our family organisations and associations that we work very closely with and do co-production with. So we're meeting with them as well. But through your readership, it would be great if they fill in the questionnaire. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. I've got another question, I think, from another request to speak from Sam.
Yeah, it's just regarding the consultation. So would there be any other options for the site if a mixed ability school isn't accepted by the public? Because I mean, personally, if I had a child with mixed ability and I had to travel up to that area, I mean, we've said it during this meeting that the A30 is quite difficult to manage without a car, and there's a lack of railway access as well to the area. Is there an alternative option that you guys are thinking about as opposed to a school?
So I think, Sam, it might be helpful if we set out what happens currently and how we work with families with children with special educational needs and disabilities in terms of travel and transport. That might sort of clarify that picture for you. And I guess this is partly it's about, you know, as we've said, at the moment we've got children who are having to travel far outside of Dorset, not just to the top north end of Dorset. They're going way outside of county with all the associated travel that comes with that, which the council supports. But Teresa, do you want to talk about the travel issues?
Yeah, thank you. So we appreciate it's barely going to be walking distance or capacity or safety for many children, some possibly, but not many. Therefore, we would be looking to run as efficient and ecological an option around school transport that we could. We'd be starting from that kind of first position. So we'd be looking to have those two things achieved by that. We already work with families to do a couple of things really, which is to make sure that we transport their children safely and effectively. And of course, throughout the whole of the COVID period, we've been continuing to do that and to have as many sensible routes that are very carefully logistically planned to limit the cost of that. But also as children and young people get older, we want them to be able to access transport where they can themselves, and appreciate this site isn't ideal for that, but we'd be looking at any option that we could use to be able to get children to be able to transport themselves around, because that's really important for young people with additional needs, that they can do that as they mature. So that's work we already do. As Matt said, we have a very complex logistical deployment of a huge amount of SEN travel already, and that would be the same for these children.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sam. I don't see any other questions. Are there any other questions from colleagues that they want to ask today? We will, of course, share the slides. I think Kate's already posted that. And then obviously you've got the press release going out about the consultation, which we launched today for 6 weeks until the 18th of March. And we would really value as many responses as possible that people can do. So they can go through the consultation process. They can fill that in online. There's also a telephone number that people can telephone and ask for a copy to be sent to them. We're conscious that we are in slightly different times at the moment. We can't do the same things that we do face-to-face normally, but actually it's helpful, isn't it? Because we've all been able to join from wherever we are rather than having to drive or to travel to a media briefing. So I can't see any more questions, so I'm going to just say thank you very much indeed and look forward to hearing feedback from your readers over the next 6 weeks. Thank you.